The alarm started exactly the way all nightmare alarms start. At the absolute wrong millisecond, in the absolute worst possible location, armed with that specific psychotic cruelty that massive emergencies have when they refuse to knock before kicking the door off the hinges. The sound was a piercing, violent shriek, the kind that aggressively slices through the pressurized, recycled air of a luxury cabin cruising at 30,000 feet, with a terrifying clarity that absolutely obliterates any room for doubt. The massive private jet violently shuddered as it slammed into a pocket of dead air, and it was in the exact microsecond of that violent jolt that the baby completely stopped making noise. And when a screaming infant suddenly goes dead silent, anyone who has ever spent a day in the trenches keeping humans alive knows that the silence is infinitely more terrifying than the screaming. Lucia saw the kill shot before anyone else in the cabin even realized they were in a war zone. The little boy's lips were a sickening dark shade of blue. Not the pale, shivering purple of a kid who stayed in the pool too long, but that specific, terrifying, radioactive blue she had aggressively learned to hunt down in a pediatric ICU decades ago. The exact shade of blue that screams the brain is rapidly starving for oxygen, a symptom that carries a heavy, multi-syllable Latin medical name that she had permanently burned into her skull, but right now didn't matter nearly as much as the location of the emergency drop valve bolted to the cabin wall. She had violently dropped to her knees on the plush imported beige carpet, ripping the infant into her arms before a single billionaire in that cabin had even processed the drop in cabin pressure. Her right hand was already aggressively hunting for the manual oxygen override valve, with a terrifying, absolute certainty that isn't born from some corporate safety seminar, but forged from years of raw muscle memory, thousands of brutal graveyard shifts in a level 1 trauma center, where every single second you waste trying to find the solution is paid for in body bags. Her left arm locked around the dying boy with ironclad stability. It wasn't the frantic, shaking grip of panic. It was the brutal, unyielding foundation of a master operator who knows that a crashing body requires absolute structural support to absorb the incoming shock of resuscitation. Inside her brain, the tactical checklist was executing in flawless, rapid-fire sequence, a protocol she had drilled so relentlessly it had completely bypassed conscious thought and mutated into pure, lethal instinct. Aggressive cabin depressurization. Critical atmospheric drop. I need 100% pure oxygen on a direct feed. Right damn now. The heavy brass valve snapped open. Right behind her, the oblivious, arrogant world kept shrieking. Get your filthy, disgusting hands off my stepson. The blonde's voice ripped across the cabin, weaponizing that specific toxic volume that isn't about communicating danger. It's purely about demanding absolute submission. You have done enough pathetic damage, flight attendant. I want this deranged woman physically restrained immediately. Lucia didn't even flinch. She didn't rip her eyes off the dying infant. She slammed the pediatric oxygen mask over the boy's face with the brutal, satisfying click of a sniper, seating a fresh magazine. Her scarred hands were shaking, but they were the hands of a veteran that knew exactly how to execute the mission even while trembling. Hands that had learned decades ago that the physical shake is just the heavy biological tax your nervous system pays for maintaining absolute, God-tier focus. Not a catastrophic failure, just the cost of doing business. The baby didn't respond. And in that heavy, suffocating, suspended silence cruising at 30,000 feet, while the wicked stepmother was still hysterically shrieking, while the terrified flight attendant was paralyzed in the aisle desperately trying to figure out if he should play cop or medic, and the insulated, arrogant reality of the private jet completely imploded, Lucia just stared down into the boy's gray face with the terrifying absolute focus of a woman who has completely deleted the rest of the universe, knowing that the only thing that actually exists on planet Earth is the next 60 seconds. But to truly wrap your head around how she ended up on her knees burning holes into that plush beige carpet, armed with shaking hands and an absolute, unbreakable faith, we have to hit rewind. We need to go all the way back to the freezing tarmac of an elite executive airstrip, where this entire bloodbath kicked off with the deafening roar of a multi-million-dollar jet spooling up for launch. The morning was bleeding that harsh, sterile, artificial light that strictly belongs to private airports, too violently bright to be dawn, but far too dead and empty to be considered daytime. The massive chrome-polished Gulfstream was parked on the tarmac, its massive turbines already howling with that low, heavy, aggressive rumble of a machine that costs more than a city block, aggressively preparing to do exactly what expensive machines are built to do: defy gravity and ignore traffic. The guy wearing the bespoke $thousands suit was pacing the tarmac, an encrypted cell phone permanently glued to his ear, radiating the frantic, toxic energy of a CEO desperately trying to execute 3 massive corporate hostile takeovers simultaneously. Richard was pushing 45, sporting the exact shade of silver at his temples that looks accidental on a normal guy but looks aggressively focus grouped on a billionaire. He carried himself with that specific, terrifying lightness of a man who decided decades ago that possessing enough capital buys you the absolute right to demand the universe pause for your convenience. He killed the call. He finally locked eyes with Lucia, who was standing dead still on the freezing tarmac, cradling the infant, a heavy, beat-up canvas duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She was rocking faded generic sweatpants on an elite billionaire airstrip with the absolute, unbothered confidence of a woman who stopped giving a damn about what arrogant snobs thought of her wardrobe decades ago. "Take good care of my son," he ordered. It wasn't framed as a corporate directive. It was the desperate, fragmented plea of a father who genuinely loves his kid, but fired it off with the panicked speed of a guy who had 4 other massive fires to put out before he could even board his own jet. But there was a heavy, loaded frequency buried in those words that Lucia had aggressively learned to tune into over the years. The terrifying, specific gravity of a request coming from a man who has absolutely no idea what kind of war zone he is actually walking into, but his gut is screaming at him to beg for backup. She gave a single, hard nod. The steel stairs she was ordered to climb were the steep, narrow service hatch steps tucked near the exhaust of the aircraft. The plush, red-carpeted main air stairs at the front were currently being dominated by the blonde, who was aggressively marching up the steps with a $20,000 Birkin bag hooked over her forearm, her massive pitch-black designer sunglasses still permanently welded to her face. It's that specific toxic flex that has absolutely nothing to do with blocking UV rays, and everything to do with aggressively signaling to the peasants that the real world is entirely too pathetic to warrant her direct, unfiltered eye contact. The interior of the jet was the exact kind of sterile, untouchable environment you only see in high-end luxury lifestyle magazines. The photos bathed in soft artificial light, always completely devoid of actual human beings, because human beings are messy and ruin the psychotic illusion of absolute perfection. Flawless, snow-white Italian leather, custom mahogany paneling polished to a mirror finish that literally cost more per square inch than the monthly rent of the crumbling apartment building where Lucia was raised. A heavy crystal bucket sweating with ice, chilling a bottle of vintage champagne that was sitting there, not because anyone actually ordered it, but simply because in that tax bracket, the champagne is always waiting. The stepmother violently claimed the massive, plush captain's chair with the arrogant, thoughtless entitlement of a parasite who views every luxurious space on Earth as a direct extension of her own ego. Richard collapsed into the seat right across from her, his face already buried back into the glowing screen of his phone. Lucia was silently herded by the flight attendant all the way to the absolute rear of the cabin, banished to a cramped, rigid jump seat, shoved hard against the heavy bulkhead that separated the elite passengers from the luggage hold. She locked herself in, cradling the infant against her chest, kicked her heavy canvas bag under the seat, and immediately began prepping the thermal bottle she had aggressively sterilized and heated in her own kitchen hours before dawn. It was the hyper-vigilant, paranoid planning of a veteran who knows damn well that in gilded cages like this, the most basic, desperate human needs are the absolute last things the arrogant suits in charge will ever remember to pack. The baby locked onto the bottle, feeding with that heavy, absolute, peaceful concentration that only comes from an infant who knows they are completely protected. The stepmother spotted them from the front of the cabin. She violently wrinkled her nose, flashing an expression that wasn't genuine disgust, but a highly rehearsed performance of disgust, engineered specifically for an audience. She aggressively twisted her body toward Richard, pitching her voice just loud enough to effortlessly slice through the ambient roar of the jet engines and hit the back of the plane. "Seriously, Richard, you are still employing this creature?" A vicious, calculated pause. "With the massive capital you burned through, you could easily afford an elite certified German au pair. This woman literally looks like she just crawled out of a homeless shelter." Richard didn't even bother lifting his eyes off the spreadsheet on his phone. He offered a vague, pathetic, non-committal shake of his head. That cowardly, ambiguous gesture that could mean he agreed, could mean he was dismissing her, or was just the pathetic automatic reflex of a guy who is completely checked out of his own life. The conversation died right there. Lucia didn't look up. She kept her eyes deadlocked on the infant, She had caught every single radioactive syllable with crystal clarity, thanks to the tight acoustics of the cabin and the heavy soundproofing killing the engine noise. She felt the insult hit her chest with the massive, suffocating weight that kind of venom always carries. It doesn't hurt any less just because you've survived it 100 times before, in 100 different toxic accents. She felt the impact, and she stayed completely silent, not out of pathetic weakness, but fueled by a terrifying, ironclad discipline that had cost her years of blood and tears to forge. The lethal, necessary capacity to violently sever personal pain from the mission objective, aggressively hoarding the rage in a dark box until the war was over, ensuring it never compromised the execution of her job. And she had a massive amount of rage to hoard. To truly comprehend the weapon that Lucia was, you have to rewind a few more years. You have to walk into the chaotic, brutal halls of a chronically underfunded public hospital in a gritty, working-class city that never makes the shiny top 10 lists, but boasted a pediatric ICU that was legendary in the medical underground. A tiny, violently overcrowded ward where critical life-saving gear had to be aggressively requisitioned 3 times before it ever showed up. Staffed by a hardened crew of operators who compensated for the total lack of corporate resources with a terrifying, raw competence forged in the fires of pure desperation. And standing dead center in that bloodbath, holding the line for 11 grueling years, was Lucia, Chief of Pediatric Nursing. She didn't get the crown through nepotism, and she didn't buy it with a fancy piece of paper. She conquered that title through the brutal, unrelenting grind that starts as a grunt at 18, aggressively kicking down locked doors not because someone invited her in, but because the sheer, undeniable weight of her absolute mastery forced them open. She had manually dragged dying kids back from the brink of the abyss during catastrophic codes that the shiny medical textbooks politely summarize in 3 paragraphs, but in the real world, detonate and require a solution in 30 seconds flat. She had executed life-or-death tactical calls at 3 a.m. when the attending physician was trapped in another ward and a suffocating child absolutely did not have 30 seconds to wait for a signature. She had learned, absorbing the trauma directly into her bones over a decade, that elite pediatric emergency medicine is a violent, chaotic cocktail of raw instinct and lethal technique, blended in proportions that absolutely no sterilized university lecture hall can ever teach in the correct order. And then, she was violently stripped of everything, not for dropping the ball, not for incompetence. She was executed by a pathetic, cowardly administrative tribunal that she still physically struggled to talk about without her voice dropping an octave. A massive, coordinated corporate assassination forged in closed-door boardrooms she wasn't allowed to enter. Armed with heavily redacted write-ups, she aggressively fought, but ultimately lost because the cowards holding the pens had more signatures than she did. It was the classic, sickening reality of a broken system, where the signature of an arrogant suit holding a fake title will always legally obliterate the word of the grunt actually bleeding in the trenches. She had been escorted out holding a pathetic cardboard box, chained to a grueling, endless wrongful termination lawsuit, carrying 11 years of god-tier medical genius that absolutely refused to fit into the sanitized checkboxes of an HR algorithm, rendering her completely invisible to the arrogant recruiters who dumped her resume in the trash. Buried deep at the absolute bottom of the heavy canvas duffel bag sitting at her feet on the jet, shoved underneath a stack of spare onesies and a heavy-duty trauma kit, was a battered, pocket-sized medical emergency field manual. The cover was ripped, the pages were violently dog-eared, and the margins were completely blacked out with her tiny, frantic, hyper-dense handwriting. It was a massive archive of raw, survival data she had aggressively hoarded over the years. Lethal addendums, microscopic tactical observations, the vital, bloody details of saving a life that the sanitized, corporate-printed textbooks always fail to mention. She didn't haul that heavy book around out of some pathetic, nostalgic longing for her past. She carried it out of absolute, ironclad responsibility. Because as long as she was the one holding the line for a child, any child, anywhere on Earth, she was going to be armed to the teeth with every single tactical weapon she had ever mastered to keep them breathing. The Gulf Stream punched through the cloud layer, hitting its cruising altitude. The sunlight violently sliced through the oval windows, carrying that specific blinding, unfiltered intensity you only get at 30,000 feet, completely stripped of the soft, forgiving haze the atmosphere provides the peasants on the ground. The baby had finally passed out in her lap, completely surrendering to that heavy, absolute, trusting sleep that infants possess. a vulnerability that had always struck Lucia as one of the only truly honest things left in a deeply broken world. She sat perfectly still, just staring down at his face for a long, quiet minute. And that is exactly when the rhythm of his breathing fractured. She caught the glitch in the physical rise and fall of his tiny chest first. Then she caught the acoustic shift, or rather the terrifying absence of the right sound. Then her eyes locked onto his lips, which had rapidly bled out the healthy, warm pink of a sleeping child, aggressively mutating into a highly specific, toxic shade that she knew intimately. But she hadn't learned that color on a luxury jet. She had learned it in the deepest, darkest trenches of a pediatric ICU, where that specific shade had a terrifying medical designation and demanded an immediate, violent intervention. And the intervention launched instantly. Before a single arrogant billionaire in that cabin even realized the atmosphere had shifted, Lucia had already gone to war. The crying didn't detonate all at once. It started with a slow, insidious buildup, exactly how massive, lethal problems usually launch, with a subtle, creeping presence that offers the arrogant and the lazy a brief, tragic window to completely ignore it before it violently mutates into an unstoppable catastrophe. The infant had ripped himself out of his deep sleep with a sound that was completely alien to the standard, annoying whine of a hungry or cranky baby. This was a sharp, high-frequency, staccato shriek. It carried the specific, terrifying acoustic signature of raw, unadulterated physical agony that anyone who has ever spent a week in a pediatric ward instantly separates from the background noise. You don't diagnose it by the sheer volume. You diagnose it by the frantic, chaotic pitch, the violent, full-body contortions of the child, and the terrifyingly short, suffocating gaps between each frantic sob. Lucia had the threat locked in before anyone else even flinched. She immediately began aggressively rocking the boy, deploying a highly specific, rhythmic, gravitational sway she hadn't read in a parenting blog, but had forged through thousands of hours of desperate practice in the ICU. It was the primal, heavy rhythm that infants process as absolute safety, long before their brains can decode a single word. But the boy was violently thrashing. He was aggressively arching his spine, his tiny head whipping back and forth, his eyes squeezed shut in a rictus of pure, undeniable agony. This wasn't a tantrum. This wasn't fatigue. This was a biological system screaming for help. On the far side of the massive cabin, the stepmother slammed her crystal champagne flute down onto the mahogany table, with the aggressive, theatrical fury of a queen who has been deeply offended by a peasant interrupting her nap. "Shove a pacifier in his mouth and kill that horrific noise." Her voice sliced through the pressurized cabin with arrogant ease, completely overpowering the heavy rumble of the twin engines. "Are you completely incompetent at the one pathetic job you were hired to do?" Lucia didn't fire back. Her entire processor was locked onto the infant, aggressively running a rapid diagnostic protocol. She mapped the erratic pattern of the shrieks. She tracked the spastic, uncoordinated clenching of his tiny fists. She analyzed the severe, unnatural tilt of his neck. Every single data point violently aligned into a highly specific threat matrix she had battled 100 times before. Not at 30,000 feet, but in a totally different war zone. A place where this exact cluster of symptoms had a formal medical classification, a definitive root cause, and most importantly, a rapid tactical solution if you intercepted it before the damage became permanent. She pushed herself up from the cramped jump seat, cradling the thrashing boy against her chest, and navigated the narrow aisle with the hyper-vigilant, fluid caution of a bomb technician carrying a live explosive through a minefield. She stopped just outside the perimeter of the executive seating, close enough to deliver the intel without needing to shout. "Excuse me, ma'am." Her tone was flawlessly respectful. She had learned the hard way that in toxic environments commanded by massive egos, maintaining a heavily armored, respectful tone was the only functional passport she had to cross enemy lines. The infant is exhibiting severe symptoms of acute barotrauma in his ears. It's a highly common, excruciating reaction during flight. The rapid fluctuation in cabin pressure violently impacts the middle ear cavity of infants significantly harder than adults. She paused for a microsecond, rapidly calculating exactly how much clinical data she could deploy to validate her claim without triggering the stepmother's psychotic insecurity. "If you could authorize the pilot to execute a minor, temporary reduction in our cruising altitude, or simply grant me 2 minutes of uninterrupted access, I can execute a manual pressure relief maneuver that will neutralize the pain almost instantly." The stepmother glared at her, her face rapidly cycling from genuine shock to absolute toxic disgust, without stopping for a single second of actual comprehension. She let out a short, hollow bark of laughter that was completely devoid of humor. "Are you actually suggesting that the captain of this aircraft is going to alter his FAA flight plan because a baby is whining?" She violently whipped her head toward Richard, who had finally, slowly dragged his eyes up from his glowing screen for the first time in 20 minutes. "Are you listening to this absolute garbage? She wants to hijack the flight path." She snapped her eyes back to Lucia, deploying that sickening, slow cadence reserved for talking down to the severely brain-damaged. "You are completely, pathetically ridiculous." Lucia executed a tight, silent pivot and retreated back to her jump seat. The baby kept screaming. For the next 10 agonizing minutes, she went to war with the only weapons she had left in her arsenal. The low, resonant frequency of her own voice, the heavy gravitational rhythm of her swaying, and the manual physical interventions that don't require an oxygen tank, tactics that rely entirely on deep empirical knowledge and overwhelming physical presence. But severe barotrauma inside a pressurized aluminum tube is absolutely not a phantom pain you can just magically rock to sleep. And she knew it with the cold, hard clarity of a master who understands the unforgiving biological physics actively torturing the kid. The shrieking violently escalated. The stepmother launched out of her leather chair. She marched down the narrow aisle with the stiff, aggressive momentum of a tyrant who has already passed the death sentence and is simply walking over to pull the lever. She hit Lucia's row, and without a single word of warning, without asking permission, without even a microscopic hesitation, she aggressively thrust her arms out and physically ripped the thrashing infant out of Lucia's grip. It was a violent, territorial confiscation, completely devoid of any actual maternal instinct. The baby, violently torn from the only secure anchor he knew, ripped away from the familiar scent and the heavy, calming rhythm he had desperately latched onto for survival, immediately retaliated with the only weapon he possessed. He shrieked exponentially louder, his screams mutating into pure hysterical panic. The stepmother clutched the boy with the stiff, terrified rigidity of someone who has absolutely zero idea how to handle a baby, but would rather die than publicly admit her incompetence. She frantically attempted to bounce him, but her movements were chaotic, jerky, and completely lacked rhythm. The screaming spiked another deafening octave. She violently spun back toward Lucia, her face a contorted mask of pure, unadulterated rage, desperately hunting for a scapegoat to absorb her failure. "You deliberately starved him." The psychotic accusation was launched before her brain even tried to build a logical argument to support it. "Look at him thrashing. You are an absolute catastrophic failure." In the front of the cabin, Richard finally shoved his phone into his pocket for the first time since takeoff. Lucia stood up, locking her arms rigidly at her sides, and launched one final, desperate diplomatic strike. "The infant is not starving." Her voice was an iron rod, vibrating with the massive, suffocating pressure of a woman desperately trying to hold a collapsing building together with her bare hands. "It is severe acute barotrauma. If you hand the boy back to me immediately, I can execute a manual pressure release and neutralize the pain in less than 120 seconds. The protocol is completely safe, highly effective, and it will kill the screaming." The stepmother glared at her for one long, psychotic second, and then she aggressively flagged the flight attendant. The young guy practically sprinted down the aisle, his face radiating the agonizing, nauseating discomfort of a grunt who has been violently shoved between two warring factions he didn't choose, desperately trying to project a calm corporate facade while the entire cabin was actively melting down. "I want this deranged woman permanently removed from the passenger cabin." The stepmother's voice had dropped into that terrifying, icy register of an apex predator, delivering an order that she expects to be executed with zero friction. "Lock her in the cargo hold or physically strap her to the jump seat. I do not want her breathing the same air as my stepson." The flight attendant opened his mouth to stammer a response. The stepmother aggressively suffocated his attempt. She thrust her manicured finger directly at Lucia, who had instinctively dropped into a low, defensive crouch. Not a pathetic posture of submission, but a highly tactical, protective stance. She had dropped slightly to maintain a direct, level line of sight with the thrashing baby. The stepmother was awkwardly crushing against her chest, desperately trying to project a stable, familiar anchor point for the terrified kid, fighting to offer him a lifeline of continuity in the chaos. Lucia's eyes were brimming with tears. Not tears of fear. They were tears of pure, radioactive frustration. The highly specific, agonizing fury that only detonates when you possess the exact lethal knowledge required to defuse a bomb. And a totally incompetent, arrogant human barricade is physically blocking you from reaching the wire. You are a psychotic, attention-seeking liar. The stepmother's shriek violently overloaded the acoustics of the small cabin. You're just desperate for the spotlight. The pointing finger was rigid, aggressively accusing, fueled by the terrifying, blind certainty of a narcissist who has never been punched in the mouth for being wrong. Your place is in the back of the plane, locked away with the rest of the garbage. It is genuinely sickening to wrap your head around the fact that a human being could be that vile, isn't it? That in the middle of a medical crisis, with an infant screaming in sheer agony, begging for intervention, the absolute only thing this monster cared about was weaponizing the child's suffering to crush the one person who actually knew how to save him. If you feel that same violent outrage burning in your chest right now, smash that like button to prove you are standing shoulder to shoulder with Lucia in that aisle. The flight attendant took a hesitant, reluctant step toward Lucia. She didn't stand up immediately. She stayed frozen on her knees on the beige carpet for one critical second, her eyes dead-locked on the infant being crushed by the stepmother's rigid, spastic grip. She was running a massive, rapid-fire clinical assessment of the boy's face, a diagnostic sweep she hadn't shut off for a single millisecond since the crying started. And in that exact microsecond, she saw the kill shot. The color of his lips had fundamentally mutated. It was no longer the healthy, flush pink from before. It was no longer the deep, flushed red of a child screaming in pain. A terrifying, toxic shadow was aggressively bleeding into the edges of the boy's mouth. It was subtle, barely registering to an untrained eye, but it was an absolute blinding siren to a woman who had spent 11 years in a pediatric trauma ward aggressively hunting down that exact discoloration in its microscopic infancy, identifying the threat seconds before it mutated into a full-blown emergency, before the alarms triggered, before the critical window for intervention violently slammed shut. She launched to her feet, not with a slow, cautious shuffle, with the terrifying, explosive velocity of a master operator who has just violently transitioned from a diplomatic stalemate into a total war zone, her body aggressively executing the breach before her conscious mind even finished processing the command. The baby's screaming had fundamentally changed pitch, and Lucia was already moving, aggressively closing the gap, before a single other person in that aluminum tube even realized they were in a nosedive. The screaming died. It wasn't a slow, exhausting fade. It wasn't the gentle, whimpering surrender of a child finally running out of gas and drifting into sleep. It was violent, instantaneous, absolute. The terrifying heavy silence that isn't the presence of peace, but the horrific sudden absence of life. The stepmother felt the catastrophic failure before her brain could even process what it meant. The infant's body, which had been rigidly arched, thrashing and vibrating with the intense kinetic energy of pure agony, suddenly turned into a bag of wet sand. The muscle tension completely vaporized. His tiny head lolled sickeningly to the side, completely stripped of the natural, foundational strength that even sleeping, healthy infants unconsciously maintain. It was the terrifying, total surrender of a biological system that was no longer fighting, but shutting down. She stared down into the boy's face, and the panic that violently hijacked her nervous system wasn't the fake, calculated, theatrical outrage she had been aggressively performing for the last hour. It was raw, unadulterated, primal terror, the absolute, unfiltered nightmare fuel that violently contorts a human face into something unrecognizable, completely bypassing any attempt at control. "What the hell did you inject him with?" Her voice was completely stripped of its arrogant, commanding bass. It was a shrill, shattered, hysterical shriek of a coward frantically hunting for a scapegoat, because blaming someone else was infinitely easier than processing the corpse in her arms. He stopped breathing. Lucia was already a blur. She had violently breached the halfway point of the aisle before the stepmother even finished her pathetic accusation, moving with the terrifying, aggressive momentum of an operator who has completely stopped calculating social obstacles and is only calculating time. Every single microsecond between her and that infant was a microsecond being subtracted from a ledger that absolutely did not tolerate a negative balance. The flight attendant stepped into the fatal funnel. He didn't do it out of malice. He did it out of the pathetic, conditioned reflex of a corporate drone who had been handed a direct order from a VIP and was still blindly executing it, his brain totally failing to reboot and adapt to the catastrophic new reality of the cabin. He clamped his hand down on Lucia's arm with a rigid, desperate grip that was entirely automatic. She stopped dead. Not because his pathetic grip was stronger than her forward momentum. She stopped because engaging in a physical brawl with a panicked flight attendant would burn critical seconds she absolutely did not have in her budget. It's acute decompression hypoxia. She fired the words like armor-piercing rounds, rapid, lethal, totally stripped of the polite diplomatic pleading she had used earlier, because the time for diplomacy was dead and buried. He requires 100% pure oxygen on a direct feed right now, and he must be immediately positioned prone, with a slight negative cranial incline. A microsecond pause. If we do not execute this protocol immediately, he will suffer a massive ischemic stroke. The flight attendant froze, his brain totally short-circuiting, and his hesitation was the only opening the stepmother needed to flood the zone. "Do not let that psycho touch him." Her voice spiked into a manic, deafening screech, radiating that specific toxic brand of hysteria that aggressively feeds on itself, screaming louder and louder because she delusionally believed that sheer volume equaled control. She poisoned him. She orchestrated this entire thing. The flight attendant's grip tightened on Lucia's arm. She snapped her head and locked eyes with him. Dead center, with the terrifying, absolute clarity of an apex predator who has permanently deleted every single social filter and is prepared to burn the plane down to finish the job. You are currently physically restraining the absolute only human being in this airspace who possesses the skill set to keep that infant out of a body bag. Her voice dropped an octave, but it sliced through the hysterical screaming with a lethal precision that wasn't born from anger. It was pure, distilled, radioactive urgency. If you do not release my arm this exact second, and that boy dies, his corpse is on your hands for the rest of your life. The flight attendant blinked, but his hand stayed clamped. That was the exact millisecond the baby seized. It was a micro-seizure. A violent, rapid tremor that ripped through the boy's tiny frame from his shoulders down to his legs. Brief, but carrying that terrifying, unmistakable, erratic kinetic signature of a central nervous system violently collapsing. The brutal, involuntary spasm of a brain screaming that it is suffocating, aggressively firing off erratic electrical signals because it has absolutely no other way to communicate that it is dying. The stepmother let out a guttural sound that wasn't even a word. Richard dropped his phone. The encrypted device slammed into the beige carpet and was instantly forgotten, as he violently launched himself out of the plush leather seat with a terrifying, explosive speed he hadn't shown once during the entire flight. His face was a mask of pure horror, the devastating look of a father who just realized he showed up to the war zone 30 minutes too late. "Captain!" His voice roared into the cockpit intercom, radiating the heavy, desperate authority of a billionaire who is completely used to the universe obeying him. "Abort the flight path. Divert to the nearest strip immediately." The response from the cockpit cracked through the speaker with the icy, technical detachment of pilots managing a crisis. The math was brutal. Based on their current coordinates, continuing to the destination was actually faster than executing a 180-degree burn. Furthermore, without hard, verified clinical data on the exact nature of the medical emergency, they required a solid tactical assessment before they could authorize a massive, high-risk diversion. Richard stood frozen with the intercom gripped in his fist, and in that agonizing second, the horrific, undeniable reality of the bloodbath finally slammed into his face. A reality his phone screen had successfully shielded him from for the last hour. The stepmother kept screaming. Even in that apocalyptic moment, even with the infant violently seizing in her arms, with Richard paralyzed in horror, the flight attendant totally short-circuiting, and the entire cabin locked in a suffocating death spiral, she kept screaming, "You brought this curse on us." She hurled the toxic garbage at Lucia with the blind, erratic desperation of rage that has totally lost its target, aggressively lashing out at anything in the blast radius. "You are an absolute witch. You cursed him." Lucia tuned her out completely. Her eyes were dead-locked on the infant. She had seen enough carnage in 11 years in the pediatric ICU to know exactly when the blast doors were violently slamming shut. She knew that every single tick of the clock was a second the boy's brain was aggressively drowning in a toxic lack of oxygen. She had the entire brutal progression of hypoxic seizures memorized down to the millisecond. She had watched it violently escalate from the initial tremor to total brain death in minutes that felt like seconds when you were a helpless bystander, and felt like agonizing hours when you were the operator holding the bag. And then, the baby stopped breathing entirely. Not a shallow breath, A total respiratory failure. His tiny chest flatlined. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The flight attendant's hand went slack, releasing Lucia's arm. It wasn't a tactical, conscious decision. It was the raw, primal reflex of a human body physically reacting to the horror its eyes just witnessed. It was the exact millisecond where the arrogant corporate directive he was following was completely vaporized by the catastrophic reality bleeding out right in front of his face. Lucia didn't even wait for him to fully let go before she launched. She was already aggressively accelerating the millisecond. His grip weakened, running on the terrifying, hyper-vigilant anticipation of an operator who had been simultaneously tracking every single chaotic variable in the cabin while mapping out her assault route. She breached the gap. The stepmother was a human barricade standing dead in the center of the aisle, clutching the dying infant. Her arms were locked in a rigid, spastic death grip that was a sickening cocktail of possessive territorial ego and the paralyzing deer-in-the-headlights panic of a fraud who has absolutely no idea how to handle the bomb she's holding. Lucia didn't even tap the brakes. Her arms shot out with a violent, aggressive force that the stepmother absolutely never saw coming, that nobody in that luxurious tube saw coming. Because there was a massive, lethal difference between the quiet woman in the faded sweatpants who had silently absorbed their toxic insults for an hour and the apex operator who was currently going to war. She was no longer the invisible nanny banished to the jump seat. She was the chief of a level 1 pediatric ICU, aggressively responding to a code blue with 11 years of savage, forged muscle memory. The stepmother violently stumbled backward. Once, twice, and the infant was seamlessly ripped into Lucia's arms. The entire cabin flatlined in absolute shock for a heavy, agonizing second. Richard was still standing paralyzed with the useless intercom in his hand. The flight attendant had coward-stepped backward until he hit the bulkhead. The stepmother was physically pinned against the mahogany paneling, her face a blank, shattered mask, having finally crash-landed in a terrifying new reality. The deafening, absolute silence of a narcissist who just realized she is entirely irrelevant to the survival of the people in the room. And Lucia was already in the dirt. She was hard on her knees on the beige carpet, cradling the dying boy, moving with terrifying, fluid speed. Her hands were executing protocols they knew by heart. Her brain was firing the commands in perfect, chronological sequence. She had visually locked onto the exact coordinates of the manual emergency oxygen valve the second she boarded the jet, because that is the exact kind of paranoid, hyper-vigilant threat assessment she automatically runs in every single environment she enters, hospital or not. 11 years in the trenches permanently burns a radar into your brain that aggressively maps out the exits and the med kits long before the shooting starts. The baby was finally in the right hands. And Lucia went to work. The baby was in the right hands. And the chaotic, screaming nightmare of the cabin, the hysterical accusations, the blind panic, the toxic noise that had dragged on for what felt like an agonizing eternity, was aggressively muted. Lucia violently condensed the entire universe down to a single, hyper-focused point. The boy. She flipped him prone across her lap with a fluid, terrifyingly efficient motion. It possessed the exact, heavy grace of an action that has been drilled so many thousands of times it ceases to be a medical technique and becomes an absolute, instinctual extension of the operator's own skeleton. She locked his head into a slight negative incline, angling it just below his chest. It was a highly specific, tactical posture that looks completely wrong to an amateur, but was driven by a brutal, exact physiological calculus that she didn't have the time or the inclination to explain to the audience. Her free hand shot like a piston toward the emergency bulkhead panel. She had mentally flagged the exact coordinates of that panel the second she stepped onto the tarmac. She had clocked the latch type, the release mechanism, the clearance radius, running the automatic subconscious calculus of a veteran who survived in a war zone where knowing the exact location of the crash cart is the razor-thin line between a save and a body bag. It wasn't a deliberate, conscious thought when she boarded. It was just the apex predator's eye doing what it was trained to do. The panel popped open. The pediatric oxygen mask was sitting right there. The exact right gauge, with that familiar, soft oval seal that she had clamped over the faces of dying kids more times than she could ever count. Her scarred fingers seated the mask over the boy's nose and mouth with a blind, flawless precision that didn't require a mirror or visual confirmation, because the muscle memory lived deep in her hands, forged in a place far older and deeper than conscious thought. As her fingers violently cranked the oxygen flow valve wide open, she started barking orders, not to the stepmother, not to Richard. She fired the commands blindly into the cabin, utilizing the exact same heavy, authoritative command voice she weaponized during countless 3 a.m. code blues, when she demanded the terrified medical staff around her operate as seamless, flawless extensions of her own hands. I need a sphygmomanometer and a stethoscope. In my hand. Right damn now. The flight attendant was moving before the final syllable even left her mouth. There was a massive gravitational weight in her tone that violently bypassed his brain and hardwired directly into his survival instinct. The absolute, undeniable authority that doesn't come from a plastic name tag, but from raw, lethal competence being aggressively deployed in real time. He scrambled to rip open the aircraft's heavy-duty medical jump bag. Lucia didn't take her eyes off the boy. She was aggressively running telemetry, scanning the deep, toxic blue of his lips, monitoring the complete lack of rise and fall in his chest, running her fingertips lightly over his tiny hands every few seconds, checking for capillary refill, checking for any microscopic pulse of life. She was speed-reading the kid's biological system using the ancient primal language she mastered, long before she ever cracked a medical textbook. The raw physical distress signals the human body screams before it even has the vocabulary to cry. 45 agonizing seconds after the mask was seated, the boy coughed. It was a pathetic, weak, microscopic sputter, but it was there. A biological reflex. A direct response. His paralyzed respiratory system screaming that it had finally caught the fuel it needed and was violently trying to reboot the engine. Then the crying hit. It was weak, raspy, nothing like the deafening, agonized shrieks from before. But it was undeniably there. The fragile, exhausted cry of a kid clawing his way back from the edge of a very dark, very permanent cliff. The horrific, toxic blue began slowly receding from the edges of his lips, aggressively surrendering to the warm, flushed pink that actually belonged on his face. It was a slow, grueling retreat, like a ghost being dragged back into the light. The entire cabin was paralyzed in dead silence. The flight attendant rushed back and froze 3 feet away, clutching the open medical kit like a shield, staring at her with the terrified, blank expression of a guy watching a miracle he has absolutely zero professional context to understand. Lucia snatched the stethoscope out of the kit without even looking up. She jammed the earpieces in. She pressed the diaphragm against the boy's chest with the exact hyper-calibrated pressure required, light enough not to bruise, firm enough to catch the signal. She listened for 5 heavy seconds, slid the bell, listened again. Then she ripped the stethoscope out of her ears, and for the absolute first time in 20 minutes, she allowed 1 heavy, suffocating second of dead air to exist before she spoke. Richard was standing 2 feet away from her. His face was the hollow, shattered mask of a man who had dropped his encrypted cell phone and completely forgotten it existed. He was trapped in that agonizing, purgatorial void that parents occupy when their kid is dying right in front of them, and they realize, with sickening clarity, that they are absolutely useless. How in God's name do you know how to do this? The question dropped out of his mouth with a raw, brutal simplicity. It wasn't rhetorical. It was the desperate, grasping question of a man who is frantically trying to rebuild his shattered reality and realizes he's missing a massive, critical puzzle piece. Lucia made a microscopic adjustment to the oxygen mask's seal before she even bothered to answer. She didn't stop working. She didn't need to pause her execution to hold a conversation because her hands were trained to operate entirely independent of her mouth. She had spent a decade doing this exact same routine, answering the frantic, terrified questions of hysterical parents, while her hands relentlessly executed the life-saving procedures that absolutely could not wait for a dramatic pause. Because I was the chief of the pediatric intensive care unit at Central Hospital for 12 years, sir. Her voice was dead calm, zero bitterness, zero theatrical flair. She just dropped the heavy, undeniable fact with the exact same clinical neutrality she used to read the baby's pulse a second ago. Right up until I was unceremoniously terminated to clear a desk for the hospital director's niece. Richard froze like he'd been shot. Lucia reached blindly into the heavy canvas duffel bag she had kicked under the seat when she first boarded. She dragged out a battered, faded, heavy-duty plastic hospital ID badge. The edges were violently frayed, the lamination peeling, the exact look of a high-clearance keycard that had been swiped 10,000 times in the trenches and then shoved into a dark pocket where it was never supposed to see the light of day again. She casually tossed it onto Richard's lap. He caught it. He stared at it. The photo was a younger version of her, armored in pristine white scrubs, wearing the exhausted, hyper-focused expression of an operator in the middle of a brutal shift. It wasn't a posed, smiling corporate headshot. It was the raw, unedited mugshot of someone who was way too busy keeping kids alive to care about the lighting. Below the photo, her name was stamped in bold utilitarian font. Below the name, the rank, and the tour of duty. Nurse Lucia Mendez, Chief Pediatric ICU, 15 years active service. Richard stared at the battered plastic card for a long, agonizing minute that went way beyond just reading the text. He was mentally rewriting his entire universe. The stepmother was still glued to the mahogany bulkhead. Her arms, which had been aggressively crossed in arrogant defiance an hour ago, were hanging dead at her sides. She radiated the pathetic, broken posture of a tyrant who had just had her spine violently ripped out and hadn't figured out how to stand up without it. Her face had aggressively cycled through every single toxic emotion in her arsenal and had finally flatlined into absolute, dead white nothingness. No rage, no arrogant sneer. Her entire weapon system was completely empty. Lucia finished a final pulse check, pressing 2 fingers hard into the boy's tiny wrist. She counted the beats, logged the number in her head. Satisfied, she dialed the oxygen flow meter down exactly 1 notch, manually throttling the pure O2, because the boy's respiratory drive had stabilized enough that the maximum blast was no longer tactically necessary. Then, she slowly raised her eyes and locked onto the stepmother. There was no screaming rage in her eyes. There was only that terrifying deep ocean serenity that isn't built on apathy. It's the heavy bulletproof peace forged only by operators who have waded through massive, catastrophic losses, survived the fire, and come out the other side completely stripped of fear. The kind of serenity that absolutely terrifies cowards. "You demanded I be locked in the cargo hold." Her voice was a low, dead calm rumble, direct. She didn't need to inject any aggressive venom into the words, because the raw, undeniable facts were heavy enough to crush the woman on their own. "What exactly would your game plan have been if I was sitting in the dark when he stopped breathing?" The silence that nuked the cabin was the heaviest, most absolute silence of the entire flight. The stepmother opened her mouth. Absolutely nothing came out. Not because she was carefully formulating a slick PR spin, but because her brain had totally crashed. There was absolutely no fake sanitized corporate lie she could vomit out in that cabin, standing over the infant who was finally breathing normally, cradled in the arms of the exact same woman she had just screamed at and called a curse. Her jaw snapped shut. Richard looked down at the battered hospital ID in his trembling hand. He looked at Lucia. He stared at his son, still strapped to the pediatric mask, the healthy pink flush finally dominating his face, his heavy eyelids slowly fluttering open with the exhausted, confused blink of a kid waking up from a nightmare. The encrypted cell phone was still lying dead on the beige carpet where he dropped it. He didn't even twitch to pick it up. The Gulfstream slammed onto the tarmac an hour ahead of schedule. It wasn't their luxury destination. They had violently diverted to the nearest heavy-duty airstrip, running a code-red emergency vector that the pilot had requested over the radio with that terrifying, icy, dead-calm cockpit voice, the exact tone trained professionals use to broadcast absolute panic without ever sounding like they're panicking. The perfect lethal balance of urgency and control. Lucia kept the pediatric mask clamped over the boy's face for the entire aggressive descent. She never moved off the floor. She stayed hard on her knees on the beige carpet, locking the boy in her lap, relentlessly monitoring his chest rise, manually verifying his pulse every 60 seconds, aggressively throttling the oxygen flow valve to perfectly match the cabin repressurization as the jet dove toward the deck. She kept up a low, constant, rumbling hum of conversation with the kid the entire time, not because he understood a single word she was saying, but because he implicitly understood the frequency. The heavy, unshakable, steady tone he had learned to process as absolute safety from day one. When the massive landing gear finally screeched against the asphalt, she felt the boy physically melt into her lap, releasing the last ounce of trauma. The emergency medical strike team was already waiting on the tarmac. 2 hardcore paramedics flanking a low-profile gurney, armed with a heavy pediatric trauma kit that Lucia visually audited and cleared in a 3-second tactical scan as she marched down the air stairs. She cataloged their gear with the terrifying automatic reflex of a commander who assesses the weapons before the firefight, not after. She handed the boy over, but she didn't just dump him and step back. She executed a flawless, rapid-fire clinical handoff. She verbally unloaded the entire dossier, the estimated duration of the hypoxic event, the exact chronological sequence of her interventions, the infant's specific physiological response to every single maneuver, and the final exact pulse rate measurement she took before the doors popped. The paramedics locked onto her, furiously writing down the intel, radiating that specific hyper-focused respect that emergency operators only give when they realize they're taking a briefing from a heavyweight who knows exactly what the hell they're talking about. One of the medics stopped writing and looked her dead in the eye. "Are you an MD, ma'am?" "RN," she fired back instantly. "Former chief of pediatric ICU." He gave a slow, heavy nod. The exact kind of deep, unspoken respect from a grunt who fully understands the massive gravity of that title in the context of the bloodbath they just averted. Richard stumbled down the stairs right behind her. He had left his phone on the jet. It wasn't an accident this time. It was a violent, deliberate execution of his old life. He had consciously left it rotting on the leather seat before he stood up. The physical manifestation of a guy aggressively signaling to his own brain that the next 10 minutes required absolute, undivided presence. He closed the gap and stood next to Lucia while the medics ran their final sweep on the kid. He just stood there for a heavy minute, physically vibrating with the agonizing, suffocating paralysis of a man who has a mountain of debt to confess, and absolutely no idea how to start digging the hole. Then he just dropped the hammer. He didn't whisper it. He projected it. He used the volume of a man who intentionally wants to broadcast his own failure, fully understanding that a private apology is cowardly, and that the sheer weight of having witnesses makes the confession real. "I catastrophically failed." He ripped the Band-Aid off without a single corporate excuse. "I failed when I arrogantly ignored your warnings. I failed when I buried my face in a screen while you were being violently humiliated 3 feet away from me." A brutal, heavy pause. "And I catastrophically failed when I let that parasite anywhere near my son, arrogantly assuming I knew what she was." Lucia stared at him, letting him bleed out without interrupting. "I am so incredibly sorry," he choked out. It wasn't the slick, sanitized PR apology of a CEO managing a crisis. It was the raw, jagged, bleeding confession of a man who had to dig deep into his own soul and was deeply sickened by the cowardice he found hiding down there. She gave a single, slow nod. She didn't feed him the lie that everything was fine, because it absolutely wasn't fine. And there is a profound, ironclad integrity in refusing to validate garbage behavior just to make someone feel better. But she accepted the surrender with the heavy dignity of a woman who doesn't need to torture a defeated enemy to validate her own worth. Inside the sterile, blinding lights of the terminal, the stepmother had finally dragged herself off the jet. The priceless Chanel dress was violently wrinkled and twisted in a way that seemed physically impossible for fabric that expensive, and that tiny, pathetic detail screamed volumes about her internal psychological collapse. She aggressively tried to flank Richard, moving with the pathetic automatic reflex of a parasite desperately trying to reattach to a host that had already completely mutated into a different organism. Richard slowly pivoted to face her. They were surrounded by a chaotic perimeter of flight crew, the paramedic team loading the gurney, and random airport personnel who had swarmed the gate. It wasn't a private VIP boardroom. It was the real world, fully present and watching, the exact kind of public arena where cowards usually beg for privacy. "This marriage is permanently terminated." He didn't scream. He didn't have to. "You almost executed my son purely out of your own toxic, psychotic arrogance." He dropped every single word like an anvil, leaving absolutely zero margin for negotiation or spin. "I was completely blind. I am officially done being blind." The stepmother's mouth snapped open with the frantic, desperate speed of a liar, whose mouth is trying to outrun her brain, desperately trying to vomit up a defense before she even knows what she's defending. "Richard, I swear to God, I was just aggressively trying to protect. You were aggressively trying to lock the absolute only human being who could save my son's life into a cargo hold." His voice dropped into a sub-zero, terrifying register that was infinitely more lethal than a shouting match. "There is absolutely no spin on this that I will ever listen to." An airport security contractor stepped into the perimeter with the quiet, aggressive efficiency of a guy who just caught a silent nod and was executing the extraction without needing a briefing. The stepmother stared at the guard, stared at Richard in pure horror, stared at Lucia, who was standing a few yards away, watching the entire execution with the exact same serene, untouchable peace she had wielded since the moment the screaming started on the jet. There was absolutely no smug victory lap on Lucia's face. Just the heavy, quiet expression of a master who watched the universe violently correct itself and didn't feel the need to throw a parade about it. The stepmother was physically escorted out of the terminal, clutching her $20,000 Birkin bag, her designer sunglasses hopelessly lost somewhere in the wreckage of the cabin, totally unable to hide her shattered face. Richard turned his back on her and walked straight to Lucia. The negotiation went down on a cheap plastic waiting bench in the terminal, while the paramedics ran the final vitals on the kid 50 feet away. They sat with that heavy, awkward spacing of two survivors who were still trying to catch their breath after the fuselage ripped open. He dropped the offer with the ruthless, cut-the-crap objectivity of an apex predator who had made his decision and was executing the wire transfer. He pitched a staggering blank check salary, dropped with the casual ease of a man who plays with commas for a living. And he offered her the throne, Director of Family Health Operations, fully funded, fully staffed, ironclad job security. Lucia let him lay the entire pitch on the table. She let a heavy 10-second silence bleed out after he finished. "I absolutely will not take a single dime of that bonus cash," she stated. It wasn't some fake performative humility. It was the absolute raw simplicity of a woman who knows exactly what her soul requires and refuses to be bought. "I will take the director title, but I have non-negotiable terms." Richard didn't blink. He waited. "You are going to finance and mandate a hardcore, elite first responder trauma training protocol for every single employee on your payroll." She delivered the demand with the terrifying clarity of a visionary who hadn't just dreamed this up 5 minutes ago. She had been forging this plan in the dark for years, weaponizing her downtime to imagine how much less blood would be spilled if the arrogant suits actually knew a fraction of what she knew. "And you are going to immediately authorize the hire of 2 extremely competent, unemployed trauma nurses I have on speed dial. Elite operators who were purged from the system for political garbage that had absolutely zero to do with their ability to save lives." A heavy beat. That is how we actually build an empire. Richard stared at her, completely paralyzed for a long minute. Then he shoved his hand across the plastic bench. She gripped it and locked the deal. The ensuing months were the kind of massive subterranean shifts that the glossy magazines never report on, but fundamentally mutate the DNA of an empire from the inside out. The trauma protocol was aggressively rolled out in 3 phases, hitting the frontline grunts first, then violently expanding upward until it swallowed the entire corporate ladder. Lucia didn't outsource the curriculum. She drafted the entire master syllabus herself, burning the midnight oil during week 1, scratching out the tactics in a cheap spiral notebook with that tiny, frantic handwriting forged from decades of updating medical charts in the dark. The 2 veteran nurses she demanded were instantly onboarded. One had been starving for a shift for 2 years. The other had tragically surrendered to a pathetic desk job just to pay the rent, locking 11 years of elite trauma mastery in a drawer because the system had permanently bolted the doors shut. Lucia kicked the doors off the hinges. On a cool, crisp afternoon a few months later, Lucia was standing dead center on the stage of a massive corporate amphitheater. She was armored in a pristine white lab coat, the corporate logo discreetly stitched over her heart. It was the exact same uniform she had bled in for 15 years, before a pathetic administrative tribunal ripped it off her back, and she wore it now with the massive, undeniable gravity of a crown that had to be conquered twice. Sitting in front of her were rows of high-level executives and corporate grunts, their notebooks open, radiating the intense, desperate focus of people realizing they are finally being taught how to survive a war they didn't know was coming. She was delivering the final kill shot of the lecture. Your ability to stop someone from dying has absolutely zero correlation with your tax bracket. Her voice boomed with the undeniable heavy authority forged from commanding hundreds of code blues, hitting every single syllable with lethal precision. It doesn't care about your corporate title. It doesn't care if you're wearing a bespoke suit or faded sweatpants when the bomb drops. She paused, letting the silence suffocate the room. It relies entirely on whether you have the spine and the humility to shut up and learn the tactics before you're the one bleeding out. Standing in the shadows at the back of the auditorium, Richard was leaning against the drywall, holding his son. The boy had grown enough to stand and grip his dad's finger, but he was hitting that late afternoon wall where he just wanted to be held. Richard was staring at Lucia, his face radiating the profound, terrified awe of a man who realizes how incredibly close he came to throwing away his salvation. Miles away, buried deep in a mid-tier suburban mall, The harsh fluorescent lights were buzzing over a sterile, generic retail clothing store. Trapped behind the cash register was a woman with messy, unkempt hair, completely stripped of the massive designer sunglasses that were always more of a weapon than a shield, totally lacking the $20,000 Birkin bag that used to anchor her entire fake identity before it was violently detonated on an emergency tarmac. On a cheap muted TV bolted to the drywall behind the register, squeezed between garbage commercials, a short local news segment flashed across the screen, highlighting a revolutionary corporate trauma training protocol that was setting a new industry standard. The camera panned across a massive amphitheater. It showed a sea of executives furiously taking notes. It zoomed in on the face of a woman in a pristine white lab coat, commanding the room with the effortless, terrifying calm of an apex predator who never needs to scream to dominate the airspace. The woman trapped behind the register stared dead at the glowing screen. She just stood there, paralyzed, for a long, heavy minute. Then a customer slammed a cheap sweater onto the counter. She jerked her eyes down to the barcode scanner, and the broadcast rolled on without her. Now I'm throwing the mic to you. Have you ever watched an arrogant bully humiliate someone because of their cheap clothes, their accent, or their job title, only to get completely nuked when that peasant unleashed a god-tier talent that silenced the entire room? Drop your war stories in the comments below. I want to read the bloodbath. This brutal story aggressively proves that your true, undeniable value will never, ever fit on the pathetic fake label that cowards try to slap on your chest. The lethal, god-tier knowledge hoarded in the dark, by the people society aggressively ignores, is exactly the weapon the universe deploys when the sky starts falling. And the ironclad humility to shut your mouth and learn from the master, regardless of whether they are wearing a bespoke suit or a faded apron, is the absolute only intelligence that will keep you alive when the alarms start screaming. If you love stories that hit you right in the chest and force you to look in the mirror, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss the next execution. Our crew is waiting for you in the trenches.